As Martha mentioned, I have been working with several states on the development of asset management plans, and we happen to be working with the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet on their asset management plan. So familiar with some of the situations in Kentucky and just love the state. It's an absolutely beautiful place. So there are three things that I'm hoping that you'll be able to get out of today's session. First, I want to introduce you to the main components of some of the tools that are available to support, kind of provide you with a framework for managing pavements and give you an idea of the components that are part of that, so you have an idea of the tools that are available to support your decision processes. Secondly, I would like to introduce to you some strategies that will help you maximize the dollars that you do have available. And these strategies make use of early interventions before pavements are severely deteriorated, because these treatments can slow the rate of deterioration, delay the need for more expensive rehabilitation, and they can do that at a very low cost. So we'll talk about that also. And then finally, I want to provide you with some resources that will help you be able to tell your story a little bit more effectively. In asset management, we talk about telling your story, being able to communicate your needs effectively to different audiences. Now, my presentation focuses primarily on managing pavements, but the concepts that we're going to talk about today can easily be applied to any other assets that you are responsible for managing. I want to start just by recognizing that there are a lot of challenges to managing pavements. In many instances, the network is aging. And many of your pavements have probably exceeded their design life already. So they're deteriorated and you're trying to figure out what to do with them. There are also some local roads that have not been designed. These are roads that have been paved over a dirt road or a gravel road or something. So they don't have the structure that some of the state roads have, so they have different deterioration issues. You also have a lot of competing needs for the limited dollars that are available. You have safety, mobility, preservation, equity, environmental considerations, all competing for the same dollars. So how do you decide where you're going to invest your money, and what priorities are you trying to address? Public expectations are high. The public expects roads to be safe. They expect them to be smooth, and they want them to be available so that they can get where they want to go without delay. So how do you balance all those competing needs? And then today, we also have workforce issues, supply chain issues. We have inflation rates that are driving up the prices of the materials that you're using. And so you're really not able to do as much as you once were. So you have a lot of things that you're trying to deal with as you manage your pavements. As a result of that, agencies have a fairly large background of unfunded needs that have to be addressed. They're also finding that they're dealing more with emergency repairs and reacting rather than planning their activities. And as a result of that, agencies are finding that their programs continue to address those pavements that are in the worst condition. And they find that they're in this sort of never-ending cycle of always trying to take care of the worst roads and dealing with a lot of deterioration. So that's kind of the environment in which you guys are working in. So I'm proposing that if we're going to talk about transportation asset management, or TAM as we refer to it, and introduce to you an asset management framework that can help agencies lower your long-term costs for asset preservation, help you use your funds effectively, justify your funding needs and requests, and make sure that your investments are aligned with what your agency sets as a priority. We'll also introduce ways that you can mitigate some of the significant risks or uncertainties that you have to deal with, and improve transparency in the decision process. Now, before introducing the framework, I want to introduce a definition for transportation asset management. And this definition comes from the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials. So I'm going to give you guys a minute to read the definition. And I want you to particularly notice the phrases that I've highlighted in green. As you'll see, I've kind of highlighted that this is a strategic and systematic approach. So a strategic approach to me means that you're thinking into the future. You're thinking about what's going to be best in the long run and not just what's best for today. Systematic means that it's kind of a structured approach that they're going to be using. You'll notice it also focuses on both business or economic and engineering processes. So we're looking at the cost effectiveness of some of the decisions that are being made. Asset management in the end is really how you allocate the funds, allocate and use the funds that are available to you. And we're going to give you some tools to support your decision-making processes, but they're going to be dependent on having quality information and a good idea of what you're trying to achieve. In the end, asset management helps you do two things. It helps you tell your story more effectively and manage your assets as effectively as possible. When you're thinking about telling your story, it'll help you do that because you can better document what your needs are. You can show that you're using a process that allows you to improve your accountability in the decisions. You can take into account some of the risks or uncertainties that you're dealing with because you'll be able to understand the consequences of different decisions that you're making. And you can make use of technology to support you in telling your story. And I'll show you some ways of doing that. In terms of managing your assets as effectively as possible, you can make sure that the dollars that you have and the way that you're spending them are aligned with what your agency thinks its top priorities are. So that helps you make sure that you're all aligned and your decisions are supporting those overall agency objectives. By using preservation treatments, we're able to extend the asset service life as long as possible, preserve the value that you have invested in your pavements, and reduce the annual cost of maintaining those pavements. So there's a lot of positives that can come from this. To tell your story effectively, there are several questions that you'll want to be thinking about. What do you have and what condition is it in? What level of service is desired? How do you balance what dollars are available and what risks you're facing? So, you know, what conditions are you trying to achieve? What is it going to cost in order to achieve those conditions? And what options are available to you for doing that? And then what are some of the consequences that you're going to face if those repairs aren't made? And by communicating the consequences, decision makers have the information that they need to sort of defend their positions or to at least understand what the consequences are going to be if they don't fund your needs. Asset management really promotes a preservation strategy, which is different than some of the traditional ways we maintained the network. In the graphic on the left-hand side, the gray line indicates that, you know, pavements are going to deteriorate over time. And traditionally what we did was we let those pavements deteriorate. We then got funding for rehabilitation or reconstruction, and we started the deterioration all over again. And that's what we refer to as a worst first strategy. And that was actually a pretty expensive way to maintain that. In asset management, we're talking about at least taking care of some of the roads that are in good and fair condition and acting a little bit earlier to keep them in good and fair condition for as long as possible. And we can do that by using low-cost treatments that extend the service life and postpone the need for that major rehabilitation. And it's actually a very cost-effective strategy to do it that way. Sometimes it helps with the people that we're talking about. You often have to talk to community members, council members, people that are not engineers, and they don't really understand some of the pavement condition information. So if we can translate this philosophy into something that they better understand using graphics like the one on the right-hand side, we can talk to them about maintaining their home, maintaining their car. I've heard people talk about, dental treatment, that you go in and you do preventive work just to prevent cavities. Any of those kinds of things help people understand. And that if you don't regularly maintain your car, for example, you're going to run into, or you run the risk of having very costly repairs. If you do the preventive maintenance that's going to be recommended, then you should defer some of those costly activities and keep your car running as long as possible. So by putting it in that framework, people often have a better understanding of what it is we're talking about. Asset management is based on the 6 principles that you can see on this slide. First of all, it's policy driven. So policies are usually made at the highest level within an organization. So the decisions that are being made in asset management should strive to achieve the agency's goals and objectives. So if your agency is a preservation first agency, the decisions that you're making should support that objective. It's performance based. So what that means is that the goals should be tied to your current and your future conditions. It's option oriented. There are a lot of ways to manage your pavements. And so in an asset management environment, we're trying to consider some of the different options that are available and see whether some of them are more cost effective than others. It's data driven. So there is going to be a dependence on some good quality data. And during our presentation today, we'll talk about what kinds of data is needed to support asset management. It's also risk-based. There's uncertainty that you face all the time. And so we want to address what are your greatest risks and are there strategies that can help mitigate those risks? And it is transparent so that the factors that influence decisions are known and you can be showing that you're being a good steward of the dollars that are available to you. Martha mentioned the Guide to Asset Management for Local Agencies that we developed for the Indiana LTAP, and it covers some of the components that you're going to hear about today. And this 5-step process is introduced in that guide for asset management. So we're talking about first step is knowing what you have, and that involves developing the inventory of your pavement assets or any other assets that you're trying to manage. The second step is assessing asset conditions. Third step is setting realistic goals or targets. The fourth step is developing the program. So that involves evaluating and selecting some of your investment options. And then the fifth step is reporting your results. And as you can see from the graphic, the Asset Management Guide for Local Agencies addresses each one of those steps in a separate chapter. So we're going to go over each one of those steps in a little bit more detail today. So the first step is just knowing what you have. By answering these types of questions, you're going to have a lot of the information that you need to evaluate your investment options. So you should be thinking about, what assets or what pavements are going to be included in your study. Are you going to include all of them? Is it going to only be your arterial roads? What do you need to do? How are they going to be identified? You have to have some way of knowing when you're talking about a particular road, what its characteristics are. So where are they? Who maintains them? Are they things you're responsible for, or is there a local homeowners association that's responsible for them? Maybe they're a county road. Need to be clear on who maintains them, and that might influence what dollars are available for managing them. How big are they? What's their length? What's their width? What are they made of? Are they concrete or are they asphalt? When's the last time they were repaired? What kind of use do they get? And where are you going to store this information? Is it something that you're going to put into a spreadsheet, or is it something that you're going to put into maybe a pavement management system? Not all agencies have the resources to build a full inventory that has all of that level of detail, and that's fine. You don't need to have all of that information. But what I've put on this slide are just some of the common types of inventory information that's collected. And even within this, there's a lot of flexibility in how these characteristics are defined. So you do need to have some street identifier, some way of identifying what your pavement sections are. In pavement management, we talk about sections as being a portion of the road network that has some unique or common characteristics, and they typically should represent project lengths. Within a town or a city, usually a section is a block by block identifier, and you manage that block. On county roads, usually they're much longer. They can be several miles long for a project length. So depending on what type of an agency you're representing, you might define your network in a different way. For each one of those sections, you want to identify a unique identifier, something that when you see it, you know what road you're talking about. So if you have a green street, you might have green in the identifier, and you might sequentially label your section. So Green Street Section 1, Green Street Section 2, and so on. You'll want to have some idea of the length and width of that, and that's so that you can approximate the area. And you'll need that area when you're estimating what your cost of repair is going to be. Now, most agencies don't know the full construction history of all their pavements. For our purposes, really, if you can just identify whether it's an asphalt or concrete surface, that's often enough. Agencies typically don't have detailed traffic information. So one of the things we use is your functional classification or road type as a representation of the level of traffic that you get. So for example, if you have an arterial road or a collector road or a residential road, that's often enough of an identifier to give us an idea of what type and level of traffic you're dealing with. It helps to have some idea of the age or last construction date so that we can tell how old a pavement is. And that gives us the opportunity to predict when it's going to need additional work, so we can start to get deterioration rates. And then it might be helpful if you have some identification whether a curb or gutter is there, so that you know whether you can apply an overlay if you're in a city. So those are examples of the type of information that might be useful. The second step is to assess the pavement conditions. And so here we need to talk about, what resources do you have available to assess conditions? And that might influence whether you have crews that can go out and collect that condition information, or whether you contract with an agency to collect the information using automated means. Both approaches have some advantages and disadvantages to them. For example, the manual methods are relatively easy. You can have your crews go out and do it anytime. Automated can move at traffic speeds. You can collect ancillary information. So at the same time, you can get information on your signs or a striping or things like that. But there are usually mobilization costs and processing time that you have to consider. So, are you going to do this in-house? Are you going to do it out? What kinds of rating procedures are you going to use? We'll talk about that in just a minute. You also need to think about how frequently the conditions change. That's going to drive how frequently you need to collect the information. I've seen some agencies that collect the information annually on their busiest roads, and then on some of their more rural or less frequented roads, they might collect the information every 2 or 3 years. So you can do it that way, and you can customize this to what your needs are. You also have to think about whether there are requirements that might drive the frequency of your condition assessments. For example, bridges are required nationally to be inspected every other year. So those kinds of things might drive the frequency of condition assessments. And you also need to give some thought to how can the data quality be maintained? What are you going to do to make sure that the information you have is reliable? But once you do have that information, you can start to produce graphics like what's shown on the right-hand side to indicate what percentage of your network is in different condition levels. There are several different ways of assessing pavement condition. The easiest are these simple windshield methods. And in these methods, somebody drives over a pavement, they make a visual assessment of the types of deterioration that they're seeing, and they assign it a score. An example of that is the PACER method, which I'm going to show you in just a minute. It's a simple 1 through 9 for an asphalt pavement that you can assign the rating very quickly. There are also more measured methods, and here a crew might go out and measure the amount of deterioration, and based on the severity, type, and quantity of distresses that they see, there is a calculation of what the index might be. And an example of that is what we call the PCI, or the Pavement Condition Index, that is an ASTM standard. This is an example of the PACER method. It was originally developed by the University of Wisconsin. It's used extensively by local agencies in Michigan and in some other agencies. There are free PACER rating manuals that are available for asphalt, concrete, gravel, and unpaved roads, dirt roads, that are available for download, that if you just Google on PACER manuals, you'll be able to find them. In the center of your screen, this is an example of what the manual has in it. This is an example of a rating 6. It gives you a descriptor of the kinds of distresses that you might see, and then there are pictures that indicate what that might look like. And the beauty of this procedure is that it's very quick, it's easy to do. Your crews can do it with very little training. And then you have information like what I'm showing on the right-hand side that you can correlate those ratings to a condition level and a typical type of repair that might be needed. Then you can use local costs for those types of repair and pretty quickly determine what your needs are for repairing your road network. So that's probably the simplest approach that an agency can use. More sophisticated from that is the measured approach, and the PCI is probably the most common example of that, where your crews would go out into the field. They would identify the distress type, severity, and quantity using specific definitions that are provided with the PCI rating. And then you enter that distress information into a database and it calculates the PCI for you. The PCI is a scale of 0 to 100, but you can see that the scores also give you a subjective assessment of what that pavement condition is. On the right-hand side, what I'm showing you is the information that you can get from the automated surveys when you have the vehicles that go out and collect the information. On the far right, you can see the actual cameras that are aimed down on the pavement where you can see some of the distress. And then you also have views out the windshield so you can locate where that pavement is in the field. So that's going to be more sophisticated, probably more expensive, but that gives you an idea of another option that's available to you. Step 3 in the process is to set the targeted level of service. So here you might think about, what expectations have been set, what do your stakeholders expect, what level of funding is available, what level of funding is going to be needed, and are there different ways of achieving those levels of service. Here are a few different ways that targets can be expressed. I've seen a lot of agencies say a certain percentage of the network should be in good or fair condition. That's a very common way of expressing some of your targets. It's a more positive way than saying what percent is in poor condition. Other agencies have set an average weighted condition. So the second bullet is an average weighted PCI greater than 70. You want a certain percentage of the network to be at that condition. I'm a little hesitant to use average conditions just because it's hard to see some changes in condition with large networks, and it tends to hide some of the growing poor network if that's actually happening in your network. I also wanted to point out with this last bullet that you can set different targets for different parts of your network. So you might have a higher target for your busier roads and a lower target for your lower volume roads. The fourth step in the process is developing the program. And it can be as simple as something that I'm showing here, or it can be more complex if you're using some of the pavement management tools that are available to develop multi-year programs. So if you have a typical frequency with which you're applying your maintenance schedule, and you have an idea of the average length of time that a road would stay in good, fair, or poor condition, you can easily put together a program that looks something like this. In this example, you can see we've used the PACER ratings and the level of repair that's suggested. In the fourth column, you'll see typical repair costs per mile and the number of miles that are that are in each one of those condition ratings. And then from that, just by multiplying the total repair by the number of miles, you can get a pretty good idea of what the total needs are for your agency. And that's the start of communicating what your needs are. There are many different types of tools that are available to help you with this, and you can select the level of detail that matches your needs. At the most simple level, you can use a spreadsheet tool. And the Nevada LTAP does actually have a free downloadable spreadsheet tool that's available that agencies can use as a first step in preparing some of those programs like what I was just showing you. A little bit more sophisticated than that, there are some public domain software. What that means is it's available. It's a software tool that you usually don't have much of a cost, or it's a very low cost to get that software. And the PAVER system that's available through University of Colorado in Boulder is one of those examples. Now, one catch-all with the PAVER approach is that you have to use the PCI system to use that particular software program. The most expensive level is the proprietary software. That means that it's software that's developed by a consultant and they control those tools. Those are usually the most configurable, which means that they can tailor it to what your particular needs are, but they're also the most expensive. Step 5 in the process is to report your results. And one of the tools that agencies are using to communicate their investment plans are these asset management plans that you've been hearing about. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. There are lots of other tools available to communicate with stakeholders. You can do some simple graphics that show the percentage of the network in good, fair, or poor condition. You can use your geographic information system or GIS tools to show where those roads are. Those are all very effective ways of communicating with different audiences. In Indiana, they actually passed legislation that promotes the use of simple asset management plans among the local agencies. And agencies that agree to put together a asset management plan, a very simple asset management plan, have access to certain grant money, and they can also charge a higher wheel tax within their community. So there are financial incentives in Indiana to preparing these asset management plans. Now, there was a reason for doing that, and that's so that the LTAP Center gets access to what the conditions of their local road networks are. So there's kind of a benefit to having it, but it's been very beneficial to the local agencies in Indiana. On the left-hand side is what's in the guide that I had mentioned as the template for an asset management plan. So you can see that this is really something pretty simple, where you identify what your roads are, the overall ratings, and what you're going to be doing over the next 5 years in the bottom table. And it's just a summary table for the next 5 years as to, you know, what year, how many miles are going to be done, what's the average cost, and what's the total cost for your program. And on the right-hand side is an example of one agency's program. It shows how many miles they're going to be addressing at each one of the PACER ratings, what their total program cost is in a 2-year period of time. So, you know, these can be much more complicated than this, or they can be this simple from a spreadsheet tool. So these kinds of examples are included in that guide that you can get from LTAP, from the Indiana LTAP. There are a lot of other ways to present the results, and as you're putting your plans together, you might think about what's going to resonate with your audience. On the left-hand side, this is an example that just shows where your money comes from. So it shows that in this example that the use of available revenue, 56% of it is going to preserve the existing assets. It's a way of communicating to people that, you know, they often hear transportation has a lot of money available to it. And by showing something like this, you're showing that half of our money has to go to other kinds of things. And so that means that only half of it is available to us to managing our network. This is an example that comes from a state DOT TAMP. This came from the Illinois Department of Transportation Asset Management Plan. But one of the things that I like about it is it shows clearly that the agency's conditions are not meeting your targets. The solid line is the target for the different parts of the network, and the orange bar graphs indicate what the current conditions are. And so you can see for their lower volume roads, there's a performance gap that is not meeting targeted conditions. And this is a quick way for people to understand what you're talking about in terms of whether you're meeting your conditions and whether you need additional dollars. Something else that I saw from the Ohio Department of Transportation is they wanted to communicate that a large 93% of the dollars that they're given are going back into the infrastructure. So they wanted this to show that they're being good stewards, that they're being held accountable for the way their money is being used. And so these kinds of infographics are also something that are becoming more popular. There's also value in making data accessible. And this is an example that came from the City of Seattle DOT, that they really put a priority on transparency, and they created a website to show their road conditions, but the conditions of other things too. So here you can go in and you can see what the conditions of their bike and pedestrian systems, their bridges, the ITS, all kinds of devices. They have this information available to the public. So I included this website just in case you wanted to explore it in a little bit more detail. I think it's also important to make the data relatable to different audiences. And this is an example from the Ohio DOT website, that it's a short, a couple-minute animated video that explains why they focus on preserving their system and how that makes good sense. And so it's something that you can take a look at and see if it's something that might be something that you present to your council or, you know, to other stakeholders as to why you're taking care of what you have. So, you know, you've heard all about this and this framework for taking care of your pavements, and you might be saying, does it work? Well, we've found over and over again that by simply making steps to move away from a worse first strategy, you can really have a significant impact on future conditions, even if you start gradually. And it works because you're taking advantage of the window of opportunity for using low-cost treatments that slow the rate of deterioration and keep roads from getting into poor condition. Now, when I talk to groups in person, I like to illustrate this with M&Ms. And so I usually give people 3 containers of M&Ms. They have 30 M&Ms in good, one bucket, in a little cup that represents good roads, 30 in fair roads, and 30 in poor roads. So you can actually, eat the exercise after you're done. We don't have that opportunity to do it today. So I'm giving you the example in a less fun way, but hopefully the point comes across. So we have a simple scenario where you have 90 miles in your network. 30 of them are in each condition category, good, fair, and poor. So that's the 30 M&Ms in the good cup, 30 M&Ms in the fair cup, and 30 M&Ms in the poor cup. Your budget is $100, and it costs $25 to improve a poor road and $5 to improve a fair road. So that's, $5 represents some of these preservation treatments we've been talking about. Each year, 10% of the network deteriorates, and we're going to compare two different strategies. The first one that we're going to look at is a worst first strategy. So we start out with the first row that 30 miles are in good, fair, and poor condition. We're going to do a worst first strategy. So remember to repair a road in poor condition, it costs us $25. So with a $100 budget, we can repair 4 miles. So we're taking 4 miles out of poor and moving it up into good. So we end up after year one with 34 miles in good condition and 26 in poor. In year two, we want to deteriorate 10% of the network. So 3 miles from the good drop into fair, and 3 miles from fair drop into poor. So that's the deterioration. At the end of year two, we're going to once again repair 4 miles with that $100, and we can see what the totals are at year two. Year three, we do exactly the same thing, and by the end of the 3-year period, we have 36 miles in good condition. We've improved the condition of the network. So cheers. Now let's look at a mix of fixed strategies where, in addition to tackling some of the miles that are in poor condition, we also hit a few of the miles that are in fair condition. And you'll remember it's $25 to repair a road in poor condition. So we're going to do 3 miles of that for $75. And it costs us $5 to improve a road in fair condition. So that's 5 miles of those that we can address. So with that $100, we're now addressing 8 miles instead of just 4 miles. So we go through this process, and in year two, we deteriorate part of the network. We address the repairs again. Year three, we deteriorate part of the network, 10%, do the repairs. And at the end of 3 years, we now have 47 miles in good condition. We still have about the same number of miles in poor condition, but we have substantially improved the condition of the network just by introducing a little bit of the budget towards preservation treatments. And what we find is this is representative of what happens when an agency is constantly repairing only poor roads. They get stuck in that cycle and never really seem to get out of it. But by tackling just a little bit of preservation, you can make a substantial difference in the condition of your network. So my suggestions for adopting an asset management framework for managing your pavements are shown here. I would suggest that you start simply and build your capabilities with time, and make sure that you adapt your approach to fit your needs within available resources. You don't have to buy the Cadillac or the Tesla. You can have a simple system that starts with a spreadsheet program and really start to have an impact. I would suggest that you prioritize your efforts so that you address the most important assets first. So what part of your network are you spending the most money on? Where are the greatest risks to you? Or what are your agency's greatest priorities? And that can help you decide where you want to get started. But if there's one recommendation or one change that you take away from this is, think about what could happen even if you take a small part of your budget and put it towards preserving the roads that are in good and fair condition and of keeping them from dropping into poor condition. Over a long period of time, you can really have a substantial impact on your network. I've listed some different resources in the presentation, and the links are available to you. And I think Martha is going to make the presentation available to you guys after the presentation so that you have access to these. So they're available to you, and I can also provide you with my contact information if you want that.